The reluctant guardian. Josephine Winters had made a career of blending into the background. In the chaotic symphony of Portland Memorial Hospital, she was the quiet note that sustained without demanding attention. Her colleagues often forgot she was in the room until they needed something, a trait that had earned her the nickname Ghost among the other nurses. "Joe, Dr. Patterson wants you in his office," Nurse Tanya called across the break room, her voice puncturing Joe's moment of peace, something about a special assignment. Joe tucked her dog-eared paperback into her bag. Special assignments weren't exactly common for someone who preferred night shifts and minimal patient interaction. She brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face and straightened her scrubs, mentally preparing for whatever disruption was heading her way. Dr. Patterson's office smelled of coffee and antiseptic. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up from his tablet. "Winters, you're being reassigned," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "Private care, a high-profile patient who needs round-the-clock attention during recovery." Joe's stomach tightened. "I'm not really suited for—" "That's exactly why you were requested," Dr. Patterson interrupted. "Nathaniel Blackwood specifically asked for someone who wouldn't fawn. His words, not mine." The name hung in the air between them. Everyone in Portland knew Blackwood Technologies, the company that had revolutionized renewable energy storage and made its founder one of the wealthiest men in the Pacific Northwest. The same man who, according to recent news, had suffered a severe accident while rock climbing in the Cascades. "It's a 3-month assignment minimum," Dr. Patterson continued. "His estate has facilities that rival our ICU. You'll be well compensated." Joe wanted to refuse. Private care meant constant interaction, constant visibility. But something in Dr. Patterson's expression told her this wasn't really a request. 2 days later, Joe stood at the gates of Blackwood Estate, a modernist structure of glass and sustainable timber that seemed to grow organically from the forested hillside overlooking the city. The security guard checked her credentials with military precision before the gates swung open silently. The house manager, a woman named Eleanor, with silver-streaked hair and keen eyes, led Joe through the sprawling residence. "Mr. Blackwood has multiple fractures, internal injuries, and a significant concussion," Eleanor explained. "He's not accustomed to dependence. It makes him rather difficult." "I understand," Joe replied softly, though she wondered if anyone truly could understand a man who had everything and yet chose isolation. Nathaniel Blackwood's suite occupied the entire east wing. When Joe entered, she first noticed the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest, then the medical equipment arranged with clinical precision around a hospital bed where a man lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Nurse Winters," Eleanor announced. Dark eyes shifted to Joe, assessing her with an intensity that made her want to retreat into the shadows that had always been her comfort. Nathaniel Blackwood was younger than she'd expected, perhaps early 40s, with angular features sharpened by pain and impatience. A week's worth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in disarray. "You're the ghost," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Joe blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "Patterson said you're called the ghost. You don't talk much, don't socialize, just do your job and disappear." His gaze was unflinching. "That's what I need. Someone who won't try to engage me in meaningless conversation or look at me with pity." Joe set down her bag and approached the bed, immediately checking the monitors and IV lines with practiced efficiency. "I'm here to help you heal, Mr. Blackwood. Nothing more, nothing less." "Good," he replied, turning his gaze back to the ceiling. The last three couldn't manage that simple concept. As Joe organized her supplies and reviewed his chart, she noticed the room contained no personal items, no photographs, no cards, no evidence that anyone beyond his staff cared about his recovery. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft beep of monitors. When she finished her initial assessment, Joe moved quietly toward the door. "I'll be in the adjoining room if you need anything." "Nurse Winters," Nathaniel called, stopping her. When she turned, his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you for not asking how I'm feeling." Everyone asks, but no one actually wants the truth. In that moment, Joe recognized something familiar in his eyes, the same carefully constructed solitude she had built around herself. Perhaps they were both ghosts in their own way. "Sometimes silence is more honest than words, Mr. Blackwood," she replied. "Rest now. Tomorrow we start working on getting you mobile again." As she left the room, Joe felt something she rarely experienced in her carefully controlled life: curiosity. Beneath the wealth and the walls, Nathaniel Blackwood was a puzzle of contradictions, and despite herself, she wanted to understand him. Little did she know that behind her, Nathaniel watched her go with the first flicker of interest he'd felt since the accident that had nearly claimed his life and left him, questioning whether anyone would have truly mourned his passing. Whispers through walls. The morning routine established itself with the precision of a metronome. Joe arrived at Nathaniel's suite at exactly 6 a.m., checked his vitals, administered medication, and assisted with basic needs, all without unnecessary conversation. For the first week, their interactions remained clinical, a choreographed dance of nurse and patient separated by the invisible barrier Nathaniel had constructed around himself. But on the 8th day, something shifted. "You don't play music," Nathaniel observed as Joe changed his bandages with gentle, methodical hands. Joe glanced up, momentarily surprised by the unsolicited comment. "Would you prefer music?" "No," he said, wincing slightly as she adjusted his position. "I'm commenting on the fact that you don't feel the need to fill every silence. The previous nurses brought portable speakers, insisted cheerful music would lift my spirits." His mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile, as if Vivaldi could mend 3 fractured vertebrae. Joe's lips curved slightly. "I find silence has its own rhythm." Nathaniel studied her with renewed interest. An unusual perspective for someone in a profession that revolves around constant human interaction. "Perhaps that's why I work nights," Joe replied, securing the last bandage. Fewer people to interact with. A quiet understanding passed between them, recognition of kindred spirits who found solace in solitude. Physical therapy began the following day, marking a new chapter in their relationship. Joe had warned him it would be difficult, but Nathaniel hadn't anticipated the white-hot pain that shot through his body with each attempted movement. "I can't," he growled through clenched teeth, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to sit upright without assistance. "You can," Joe responded, her voice soft but unwavering. "Your body is stronger than you're giving it credit for." "Easy for you to say," he snapped, frustration boiling over. "You're not the one whose body betrayed them." Joe remained unmoved by his anger. "Actually, I am." Something in her tone made Nathaniel pause. He looked up, really seeing her for the first time, the slight asymmetry in her gait that he'd previously attributed to fatigue. "Childhood polio," she explained simply, without self-pity. "India, where I was born. Before my adoption, the doctor said I'd never walk without assistance." She gestured to her legs. "They were wrong." Nathaniel's expression shifted from frustration to reluctant respect. Without another word, he gritted his teeth and pushed himself upright, holding the position for 5 seconds before collapsing back against the pillows. "Again," Joe instructed quietly. He did it again, and again, until the 5 seconds became 10, and the exercise became a silent battle they fought together. As weeks passed, their routine evolved. Joe brought books, not to read aloud as others had attempted, but to leave on his nightstand. Nathaniel noticed her selections were thoughtful. Obscure philosophy, historical accounts of resilience, poetry that spoke of solitude without romanticizing loneliness. One evening, as twilight painted the forest beyond his windows in shades of indigo, Nathaniel broke their comfortable silence. "Why nursing?" he asked as Joe checked the incision site on his back. "Someone who avoids people choosing a profession centered around care seems contradictory." Joe's hands paused momentarily before resuming their gentle work. "I don't dislike people," she clarified. "I find them overwhelming in groups. But one-on-one, there's something profound about being present during someone's most vulnerable moments. She secured the fresh dressing before continuing. My foster mother was a hospice nurse. She taught me that healing isn't always about fixing. Sometimes it's simply about witnessing someone's pain without trying to dismiss it. Nathaniel absorbed this, finding unexpected resonance in her words. And is that what you're doing with me? Witnessing? Partly, Joe admitted, meeting his gaze directly. But I'm also pushing because unlike hospice patients, you have a future waiting, whether you want it or not. Her bluntness startled a genuine laugh from him, the first since the accident. The sound seemed to surprise them both. As Joe organized his evening medications, Nathaniel watched her methodical movements. Eleanor tells me you decline the guest cottage. You drive 40 minutes each way instead of staying here. Joe arranged the pills in their designated cups. I need the boundary, she said simply. Distance helps me be effective. What she didn't say, what she couldn't articulate even to herself, was how the boundary was becoming increasingly necessary. How Nathaniel's rare, unguarded moments affected her in ways that felt dangerously unprofessional. How his intelligence, hidden beneath layers of practiced indifference, called to something within her that she'd long suppressed. What Nathaniel didn't say, what he hadn't admitted even in the privacy of his thoughts, was how he found himself watching the clock before her arrival each morning. How the house felt emptier after she left. How for the first time in years, someone saw him as a person, rather than a resource to be managed or exploited. That night, as Joe drove home through the mist-covered hills, her phone chimed with a text message. From a number she didn't recognize but immediately knew. The Whitman poem you left. When I heard the learned astronomer. You underlined the last stanza. Why? Joe smiled despite herself. She pulled into a scenic overlook and typed her response. Because sometimes we need to be reminded that knowledge without experience is empty. That calculations and lectures pale compared to looking up in perfect silence at the stars. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared before his reply came through. Is that what you're doing, Nurse Winters? Teaching me to look at the stars again? Joe stared at the message for a long moment before putting her phone away without responding. Some questions were too dangerous to answer, especially when she wasn't certain of the truth herself. But as she continued her drive home, she couldn't deny the subtle shift in their dynamic. A bridge forming across the careful distance they both maintained, built of whispered truths and silent understanding. Bridges built from broken pieces. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the glass walls of Nathaniel's suite, transforming the usually spectacular view into a watercolor painting of grays and greens. The persistent weather mirrored the mood that had settled over the estate since Nathaniel's setback. The infection was always a possibility, Joe explained, checking the new antibiotics flowing through his IV. Your body is fighting hard, but healing isn't linear. Nathaniel lay with his eyes closed, frustration etched in the tight lines around his mouth. 2 weeks of remarkable progress erased by microscopic invaders. The fever had left him weaker than he'd been since those first days after the accident. We were supposed to try the stairs today, he said quietly. Joe adjusted his pillows. The stairs will wait. And if they don't? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken fears. What if this is it, Joe? What if I never get back what I lost? It was the first time he'd called her Joe instead of Nurse Winters, the intimacy of it catching them both by surprise. Then you build something new, she answered, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. That's what humans do. We adapt. Nathaniel opened his eyes, searching her face. Is that what you did? After polio? Yes. Joe hesitated, then perched on the edge of the chair beside his bed. But there was something else I had to do first. What? Grieve. Her gaze drifted to the rain-streaked windows. We're allowed to mourn what we've lost before we move forward. Pretending the loss doesn't hurt only makes the pain last longer. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white for a fraction of a second. In that flash, Nathaniel saw something in Joe's expression, a shadow of old pain carefully contained. "What are you still grieving, Joe?" he asked softly. She stood abruptly, moving to check his temperature with professional detachment. "We should focus on getting your fever down." But the question had cracked something open between them. A door neither could fully close again. The storm intensified overnight, bringing winds that howled through the forest surrounding the estate. Joe had stayed late, concerned about Nathaniel's rising temperature, and now found herself trapped as Eleanor informed her that a tree had fallen across the main road. "The guest cottage is prepared," Eleanor said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Mr. Blackwood's condition requires monitoring through the night." Reluctantly, Joe agreed. As she settled into the cottage, a space more luxurious than her entire apartment, she felt the careful boundaries she'd constructed beginning to blur. Shortly after midnight, her phone rang. Eleanor's voice was tense. "Ms. Winters, he's asking. For you. The fever's spiked." Joe rushed through the rain-soaked garden path to the main house. She found Nathaniel restless and disoriented, his skin burning beneath her touch. "I need to get his temperature down," she instructed Eleanor, who hovered nervously in the doorway. "Bring ice packs and cold towels." As they worked to cool his overheated body, Nathaniel drifted in and out of awareness. In his lucid moments, his eyes found Joe's, anchoring himself to her presence. "Stay," he murmured as the fever began to break near dawn, his fingers weakly grasping hers. "Please." Joe should have pulled away, should have maintained the professional distance that had defined their relationship. Instead, she found herself sitting beside him, her hand still holding his as he finally fell into a peaceful sleep. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a strange new intimacy neither had anticipated. Nathaniel's fever broke completely, but something had irrevocably changed between them. 3 days later, as Joe helped him with his strengthening exercises, Nathaniel broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "You never answered my question," he said, his voice stronger now, "about what you're still grieving." Joe focused on guiding his leg through the prescribed movement. "It's not relevant to your recovery." "It's relevant to me," he replied simply. The words hung in the air between them. Joe completed the exercise in silence, her mind wrestling with whether to retreat behind her professional walls or risk the vulnerability of truth. "My parents died when I was 9, she finally said, her back to him as she arranged his medications. "A bus accident in Mumbai. I was with them." She turned, meeting his gaze directly. "I survived because my mother pushed me toward the emergency exit. I remember her hands on my back, the strength in them, the last thing she ever gave me." Nathaniel remained silent, giving her the space to continue. "I was adopted by an American couple 6 months later. They were kind, loving people who gave me every opportunity." Joe's voice remained steady, but her eyes revealed the depth of what she was sharing. "But I never stopped feeling that I was living a life that wasn't meant to be mine, that I was here because someone else wasn't." "Survivor's guilt," Nathaniel said softly. Joe nodded. "The ultimate privilege and burden, to be the one who remains." Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared wounds carried beneath carefully constructed exteriors. "After my accident," Nathaniel began hesitantly, "when I was hanging from that cliff face certain I was going to die, do you know what my first thought was?" He laughed hollowly. "Not fear, not regret, just relief. Relief that it would finally be over." Joe stilled, sensing the weight of his confession. "I built an empire, Joe, created technology that's changing the world, and I did it all while feeling absolutely nothing." His voice cracked slightly. "The loneliness. It's not because people left. It's because I never let anyone stay. Because staying means they might see what I've known all along, that behind the success there's just emptiness." Without thinking, Joe reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I see you, Nathaniel," she said quietly. And there's more there than you realize. Something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of hope so fragile it nearly broke her heart. Before either could speak again, Eleanor knocked and entered with Nathaniel's lunch tray, forcing them to separate. But as Joe left that evening, something had fundamentally changed. The bridges constructed from their broken pieces had begun to form a path neither had expected to find, one leading away from isolation and toward something neither dared yet name. In the privacy of her car, Jo allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for the man she was supposed to heal. And in the dangerous territory between professional duty and personal connection, she had no map to guide her forward. Tides of change. The late October rain had given way to crisp November sunshine that streamed through the glass walls of Nathaniel's suite. After nearly 3 months of intensive therapy and gradual recovery, he stood at the window without assistance, watching a pair of deer venture from the forest edge to graze on the manicured lawn. "They come every morning," he told Jo as she entered with his medication. "The fawn was barely walking when I first noticed them." Jo smiled, noting how naturally he now moved, how the pain that had once dominated his features had receded to occasional shadows. "They've grown comfortable here, they know it's safe." Nathaniel turned from the window, his dark eyes finding hers. "Because of you." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that neither could ignore. Since the night of his fever, since their shared confessions, the careful boundaries between them had become increasingly permeable. Professional touch occasionally lingered. Clinical conversations drifted into personal territories. Silences held meanings that neither dared articulate. "Your final evaluation is tomorrow," Jo reminded him, redirecting to safer ground. "Dr. Patterson will determine if you're ready to resume normal activities." Nathaniel nodded, taking the medication without the resistance that had marked their early days. "And then your assignment ends." The statement hung between them, heavy, with unspoken questions. "Yes," Jo confirmed, busying herself with reorganizing his already immaculate medication tray. "You've made remarkable progress. You hardly need a full-time nurse anymore." "And if I said I still needed you?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Jo's hands stilled. She looked up, finding vulnerability in his expression that made her heart constrict. "Nathaniel," the intercom chimed, saving her from formulating a response. Eleanor's voice filled the room. "Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Harrington has arrived. She's waiting in the study." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Tell her I'm not available." "She insists it's urgent, sir. Something about the Shanghai contract." Jo stepped back, professional mask sliding into place. "You should go. I'll finish up here." Nathaniel hesitated, clearly torn between pursuing their conversation and addressing the unexpected visitor. Finally he sighed. "We'll continue this later." As he left, moving with only the slightest limp, Jo allowed herself a moment of selfish pride in his recovery. She'd witnessed his journey from broken to healing, had been part of that journey, in ways neither had anticipated. Curiosity drew her to the window overlooking the front entrance an hour later. She watched as a striking woman with platinum blonde hair emerged from the house, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to Nathaniel. Even from a distance, Jo could see the familiarity between them, the casual way the woman touched Nathaniel's arm, the intimate lean of her body toward his. "Victoria Harrington." Eleanor's voice startled Jo from her observations. "Mr. Blackwood's former fiancé and current head of international operations." Jo stepped away from the window, embarrassed at being caught. "I was just checking if it might rain for his afternoon walk." Eleanor's knowing look made it clear she wasn't fooled. "Ms. Harrington has been calling daily since the accident. This is the first time he's agreed to see her." "That's none of my business," Jo replied, gathering her supplies with forced composure. "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, "but it might interest you to know that he declined her calls until you helped him regain his independence." The older woman's expression softened. "He's different since you arrived, Josephine. More present, more himself." Before Jo could respond, her phone rang, the hospital calling with an urgent staffing request. A multi-car accident had overwhelmed the emergency department. Could she come in for a 12-hour shift? Jo accepted immediately, grateful for the excuse to leave before she had to face Nathaniel again. She left a note explaining her absence, promising to return for his evaluation the following morning. The emergency room's chaos was almost comforting in its familiarity, a world where Jo knew exactly who she was and what was expected of her. Here, emotions were contained, relationships defined by clear professional boundaries. Yet as she moved from patient to patient, she found herself comparing each interaction to the quiet depth she'd found with Nathaniel. "Winters, you're distracted," Dr. Weber commented as they stabilized a crash victim. "That's not like you." "Sorry," Jo murmured, refocusing on the task at hand. It was nearly midnight when her shift ended. Exhausted, Jo found herself driving not toward her apartment but to the scenic overlook where she'd once texted Nathaniel about Whitman's poem. She parked, wrapping herself in her coat against the November chill, and stared out at the city lights below. Her phone buzzed with a text. "You left without saying goodbye." Jo's fingers hovered over the screen before she replied. "The ER needed staff. I'll be back for your evaluation in the morning." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then, "I met with the board today. They expect me back next week." The news shouldn't have affected her so strongly. This had always been the goal: Nathaniel's complete recovery and return to his life. Yet the thought of him resuming his former existence, surrounded by people, like the elegant Victoria Harrington, created an ache Jo hadn't anticipated. "That's wonderful news," she typed, the words feeling hollow. "You've worked hard for this. Will you come to the office as my private nurse during the transition?" Jo closed her eyes, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "That's not necessary. You don't need nursing care anymore." His response came quickly. "That's not why I'm asking." The truth hung between them, transmitted through digital space yet as tangible as if he'd whispered it against her skin. Jo stared at the message, heart pounding as she contemplated crossing the final boundary between them. "This isn't a good idea," she finally replied. "What happened during your recovery? It's called transference. Patients often develop attachments to their caregivers. It's not real." Minutes passed before his response appeared. "Is that what you tell yourself to make it easier to walk away? That what's between us isn't real?" The question struck too close to the truth Jo had been avoiding. She put the phone down without answering and drove home in silence, her mind a battlefield of professional ethics and personal longings. Morning brought fog that shrouded Blackwood Estate in ethereal white as Jo arrived for Nathaniel's final evaluation. Dr. Patterson was already there, conducting tests in the home gym that had been their therapy space for months. "Remarkable recovery," Patterson commented, watching Nathaniel complete a series of balance exercises. "One of the most impressive cases I've seen. Nurse Winters must have worked you hard." Nathaniel's eyes found Jo's across the room. She did. She saw potential others missed. The evaluation concluded with Dr. Patterson declaring Nathaniel fit to return to work with minor accommodations. As the doctor packed his equipment, he turned to Jo. "The hospital would love to have you back full-time, Winters." The ER staff raved about your performance last night. "Thank you," Jo replied, aware of Nathaniel watching the exchange. "I'll be in touch about my schedule." When Patterson left, silence descended, heavy with all they needed to say and all they couldn't. "So this is it," Nathaniel finally said, approaching where she stood by the windows. "Assignment completed." Jo nodded, maintaining professional distance. "You should be proud of how far you've come. Because of you." "No," Jo corrected gently. "With me. There's a difference." Nathaniel stepped closer. "I received your resignation letter this morning, effective immediately." Jo had sent it at dawn after a sleepless night of confronting truths she could no longer ignore. "It's for the best." "For whom?" His voice held controlled frustration. "You're running away, Jo. Just like I did before the accident. Building walls, creating distance. I know because I perfected the technique. This isn't the same. It is, he interrupted. You're using professionalism as a shield because you're afraid. Afraid that what we found together might actually be real, that it might demand something from you that feels too risky to give. Joe felt tears threatening and blinked them back, refusing to crumble now. You have your life to return to, Nathaniel. Board meetings and international contracts and people like Victoria who understand your world. Victoria is my past, he said firmly. And that life you think I'm eager to return to? It's what nearly destroyed me before the accident. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Do you know what I realized during these months? That success without connection is meaningless. That I built an empire but never a home. Joe shook her head, taking a step back. What you're feeling, what you think you're feeling, it will fade once you're back in your real life. This is my real life, Nathaniel insisted, gesturing to the space between them. Right here, the most real I've ever been is with you. For a moment, Joe wavered, imagining a future where she allowed herself to step into the unknown, to risk the heart she'd protected for so long. Then reality reasserted itself. Their different worlds, the complications, the inevitable scrutiny their relationship would face. Goodbye, Nathaniel, she said softly, picking up her bag. I truly wish you well. As she walked away, leaving behind the man who had somehow breached all her carefully constructed defenses, Joe told herself she was making the right choice. That some bridges, no matter how beautifully constructed from broken pieces, were never meant to be crossed. But as she drove through the gates of Blackwood Estate for what she believed was the final time, the certainty she sought remained elusive, replaced by the hollow ache of a tide receding, pulling away something essential with its retreat. Symphony of Second Chances. December transformed Portland into a winter wonderland, streets adorned with twinkling lights reflecting off fresh snow. Joe walked through the hospital corridors, completing her rounds with the efficiency that had always defined her. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. Night shifts, minimal interaction, the comfortable invisibility she had once treasured. Yet nothing felt the same. Winters, we need you in room 418, Nurse Tanya called, breaking Joe's reverie. The patient is refusing medication from everyone else. Joe nodded, gathering supplies before heading to the 4th floor. 3 weeks had passed since she'd left Blackwood Estate. 3 weeks of throwing herself into work, of declining Eleanor's concerned phone calls, of pretending she wasn't checking news sites for glimpses of Nathaniel returning to public life. Room 418 housed an elderly woman with a stern expression and sharp eyes that evaluated Joe as she entered. Are you the ghost they mentioned? The woman asked without preamble. Joe nearly dropped the medication tray. Excuse me? The nurses say there's someone they call the ghost, quiet, efficient, doesn't waste time with chatter. The woman nodded approvingly. That's who I requested. As Joe administered the medication, the woman, Beatrice Fleming, according to her chart, studied her with uncomfortable intensity. You're carrying something heavy, Beatrice observed. I recognized the look. Saw it in my mirror for years after my Harold died. Joe maintained her professional composure. Let's focus on your recovery, Mrs. Fleming. Beatrice, the woman corrected. And sometimes other people's recoveries make us confront what we haven't healed in ourselves. She patted Joe's hand with paper-thin fingers. Don't wait as long as... I did, dear. Regret is a terrible companion in old age. Joe completed her tasks in silence, but Beatrice's words followed her through the remainder of her shift, echoing the doubts that had plagued her since leaving Nathaniel. Snow fell heavily as Joe left the hospital at dawn. She sat in her car, watching white flakes accumulate on the windshield, each one unique and perfect in its brief existence before melting away. Her phone chimed with a news alert, something she'd set up despite her better judgment. Blackwood, Technology CEO makes surprise announcement, company restructuring to focus on healthcare innovation. Fingers trembling slightly, Joe opened the article. There was Nathaniel, standing at a podium looking both familiar and changed. Thinner, perhaps, but standing straight, the physical evidence of his accident nearly invisible to those who hadn't witnessed his struggle. The article detailed Blackwood Technologies' new initiative, a complete pivot toward developing affordable medical technology for underserved communities. The statement quoted Nathaniel. "A personal health crisis changed my perspective on what matters. Our company's resources can transform lives beyond profit margins." Joe read the article 3 times, heart pounding. This wasn't the return to business, as usual she had expected. This was something new. Something that reflected conversations they'd had during quiet evenings about healthcare inequities Joe had witnessed both in her childhood and her career. He had been listening. Really listening. A second news alert chimed. Blackwood announces new rehabilitation center to open in Portland, Memorial Hospital's East Wing. Joe's breath caught. The East Wing, the chronically underfunded section of the hospital that served primarily low-income patients. She clicked the link, scanning for details. The project would break ground next month, creating a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility with sliding-scale payment options. As she drove home through the snowy streets, Joe's mind raced with conflicting emotions. She had walked away to avoid complicating Nathaniel's return to his former life, but he wasn't returning to that life at all. He was building something new, something that echoed values they had shared during those months of recovery. Her apartment felt particularly empty that morning. Joe moved through her routine mechanically, making tea, checking mail that had accumulated over her string of night shifts. Among the bills and advertisements sat a heavy cream envelope with her name written in elegant script. Inside was an invitation to the groundbreaking ceremony for the rehabilitation center, scheduled for Christmas Eve. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the formal invitation. "Joe, I understand why you left. You were right. I needed to find my own way forward rather than making you my new lifeline. These past weeks have been about determining what matters, what I want my legacy to be. The center is happening because of you, not just your influence on me, but because healthcare needs more ghosts like you, people who heal without needing recognition or applause, no expectations, no pressure. Just thought you should see what you helped create." And Joe sat with the invitation for a long time, running her fingers over the embossed lettering, over the place where his pen had pressed, into the paper. The week before Christmas brought a fierce snowstorm that paralyzed the city. Joe volunteered for extra shifts, helping the hospital manage the influx of weather-related injuries. She was checking inventory in the supply closet when Dr. Patterson found her. "Winters, there you are, got a minute?" Joe nodded, following him, to a quieter corridor. "The Blackwood Rehabilitation Center," he began without preamble. "They're looking for a director of nursing. Board wanted me to approach you first." Joe stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Me? Why would they?" "Apparently, Blackwood himself insisted your name topped the list." Patterson studied her with curious eyes. "Said you understand the vision better than anyone. Something about healing being more than fixing." Her words, repeated back months later, sent a shock of recognition through Joe. Nathaniel hadn't just heard her. He had carried her perspective forward into something concrete, something that could help countless others. The position would mean creating protocols from scratch, building a team that shares your philosophy. Patterson continued. "Substantial raise too, though I'd hate to lose you from our night rotation." "I need to think about it," Joe managed, mind reeling. Patterson nodded. "Ceremonies tomorrow evening. Might be worth attending, getting a feel for the project before deciding." Christmas Eve arrived with clearing skies and freshly plowed streets. Joe stood in front of her closet, debating whether to attend the ceremony. The sensible choice would be to stay home, to maintain the separation she had established. Yet Beatrice Fleming's words echoed in her mind. "Regret is a terrible companion in old age." At sunset, Joe found herself parking near Portland Memorial's east entrance, where a heated tent had been erected for the groundbreaking ceremony. She wore a simple green dress, one of the few non-scrubs items in her wardrobe, and had arranged her auburn hair in soft waves around her face. The tent was crowded with hospital administrators, local officials, and media. Joe remained near the back watching as Nathaniel took the podium. He looked distinguished in a charcoal suit, though she noticed he leaned slightly on his cane, a subtle reminder of how far he'd come and what he'd endured. Medical crises don't discriminate, Nathaniel began, his voice carrying through the space. But our healthcare system often does. This center aims to change that equation, ensuring rehabilitation isn't a luxury, but a right. As he outlined the project's scope, Joe recognized elements from conversations they'd shared during his recovery, his questions about her experiences in understaffed facilities, her frustrations with seeing patients discharged before they were ready due to insurance limitations. Recovery isn't just about physical healing, Nathaniel continued, his gaze scanning the crowd. It's about... His words halted abruptly as his eyes found hers in the back of the tent. For a moment, the crowded room seemed to disappear, leaving only the connection between them, fragile yet undeniably present. Nathaniel recovered quickly, finishing his speech to enthusiastic applause. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed into networking groups, Joe debated slipping away. Before she could decide, Eleanor appeared at her elbow. "He hoped you would come," the older woman said softly, though he tried very hard to pretend he wasn't watching the door. Joe smiled despite herself. "The center is incredible. He's doing something remarkable." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And while I'd like to credit my years of wise counsel, we both know whose influence really inspired this change." She touched Joe's arm gently. "He's in the small office down that corridor, away from the crowd. Some things haven't changed." Joe hesitated, torn between the pull toward Nathaniel and the fear that had driven her away weeks before. "I don't know if it's wise to—" "Wisdom is overrated," Eleanor interrupted with unexpected firmness. "Trust me, I'm old enough to know. Sometimes courage matters more." Heart-pounding, Joe made her way through the corridor, finding the office. Door slightly ajar. She knocked softly before pushing it open. "Winters, there you are. Got a minute?" Joe nodded, following him to a quieter corridor. "The Blackwood Rehabilitation Center," he began without preamble. "They're looking for a director of nursing. Board wanted me to approach you first." Joe stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Me? Why would they—" "Apparently Blackwood himself insisted your name topped the list." Patterson studied her with curious eyes. "Said you understand the vision better than anyone. Something about healing being more than fixing." The words, her words, repeated back months later, sent a shock of recognition through Joe. Nathaniel hadn't just heard her. He had carried her perspective forward into something concrete, something that could help countless others. The position would mean creating protocols from scratch, building a team that shares your philosophy, Patterson continued. Substantial raise, too. Though I'd hate to lose you from our night rotation. I need to think about it, Joe managed, mind reeling. Patterson nodded. Ceremonies tomorrow evening. Might be worth attending, getting a feel for the project before deciding. Christmas Eve arrived with clearing skies and freshly plowed streets. Joe stood in front of her closet, debating whether to attend the ceremony. The sensible choice would be to stay home, to maintain the separation she had established. Yet Beatrice Fleming's words echoed in her mind. Regret is a terrible companion in old age. At sunset, Joe found herself parking near Portland Memorial's east entrance, where a heated tent had been erected for the groundbreaking ceremony. She wore a simple green dress, one of the few non-scrubs items in her wardrobe, and had arranged her auburn hair in soft waves around her face. The tent was crowded with hospital administrators, local officials, and media. Joe remained near the back watching as Nathaniel took the podium. He looked distinguished in a charcoal suit, though she noticed he leaned slightly on his cane, a subtle reminder of how far he'd come and what he'd endured. Medical crises don't discriminate, Nathaniel began, his voice carrying through the space. But our healthcare system often does. This center aims to change that equation, ensuring rehabilitation isn't a luxury, but a right. As he outlined the project's scope, Joe recognized elements from conversations they'd shared during his recovery, his questions about her experiences in understaffed facilities, her frustrations with seeing patients discharged before they were ready due to insurance limitations. Recovery isn't just about physical healing, Nathaniel continued, his gaze scanning the crowd. It's about... His words halted abruptly as his eyes found hers in the back of the tent. For a moment, the crowded room seemed to disappear, leaving only the connection between them, fragile yet undeniably present. Nathaniel recovered quickly, finishing his speech to enthusiastic applause. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed into networking groups, Joe debated slipping away. Before she could decide, Eleanor appeared at her elbow. "He hoped you would come," the older woman said softly, though he tried very hard to pretend he wasn't watching the door. Joe smiled despite herself. "The center is incredible. He's doing something remarkable." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And while I'd like to credit my years of wise counsel, we both know whose influence really inspired this change." She touched Joe's arm gently. "He's in the small office down that corridor, away from the crowd. Some things haven't changed." Joe hesitated, torn between the pull toward Nathaniel and the fear that had driven her away weeks before. "I don't know if it's wise to—" "Wisdom is overrated," Eleanor interrupted with unexpected firmness. "Trust me, I'm old enough to know sometimes courage matters more." Heart-pounding, Joe made her way through the corridor, finding the office door slightly ajar. She knocked softly before pushing it open. Nathaniel stood by the window, silhouetted against the winter darkness, his posture revealing the fatigue he'd hidden during his speech. He turned at her entrance, surprise and something more complex flickering across his features. "You came," he said simply. Joe nodded, closing the door behind her. "It's an amazing project, Nathaniel. Truly. But not why you're here," he replied, his perceptiveness unchanged. At least not entirely. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Joe took a deep breath, finding courage in Beatrice's wisdom and Eleanor's gentle push. Nathaniel stood by the window, silhouetted against the winter darkness, his posture revealing the fatigue he'd hidden during his speech. He turned at her entrance, surprise and something more complex flickering across his features. "You came," he said simply. Joe nodded, closing the door behind her. "It's an amazing project, Nathaniel, truly. But not why you're here," he replied, his perceptiveness unchanged. At least not entirely. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Joe took a deep breath, finding courage in Beatrice's wisdom and Eleanor's gentle push. "I told myself I left because it was the professional thing to do," she began. That was partly true, but mostly, I was terrified. She met his gaze directly. "Terrified that what we found was real, and that I wouldn't know how to exist in your world." Nathaniel took a careful step toward her. "My world has changed, Joe. I'm changing it." "I see that," she acknowledged, "but my fear hasn't completely disappeared. I'm still me, the quiet nurse who prefers shadows to spotlights. And you're still falling in love with you," Nathaniel finished, the simple truth of his words hanging in the air between them. "Still better when you're near. Still learning how to build something meaningful instead of just successful." Joe felt tears threatening and didn't try to hide them. "I was offered the director position." Hope flared in Nathaniel's eyes. And I'm terrified of accepting," she admitted. "Terrified it's too entangled with us, whatever us might be." Nathaniel closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "Then let me make it simple. Take the position because you're the most qualified person for it, because no one understands both the medicine and the humanity of rehabilitation better than you do. Or don't take it, and find another path that fulfills you." He gently took her hand, the touch sending warmth through her. "But either way, I'm asking you to give us a chance, not nurse and patient, not employee and benefactor. Just Joe and Nathaniel, two people who found each other when they weren't looking, when they'd both given up on being found." Joe looked up at him, seeing beyond the wealth and status to the man she'd come to know in quiet moments of vulnerability and strength. "I'm still learning how to be seen," she whispered, "after a lifetime of hiding." "We'll learn together," he promised, bringing her hand to his lips. Day by day. No rush, no pressure. Just two people building something new from the broken pieces of what came before. In that moment, surrounded by the promise of new beginnings and second chances, Joe made her choice. She leaned forward, closing the final distance between them, and kissed him. Softly at first, then with growing certainty. Outside, snow began falling again, each unique crystal joining others to transform the landscape. Inside, two souls who had once defined themselves by their isolation discovered the quiet miracle of belonging, not in grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but in the simple courage of choosing connection over fear, healing over hiding, love over loneliness. 6 months later, the Blackwood Rehabilitation Center opened its doors under the direction of Josephine Winters, whose innovative approaches to patient care quickly gained national attention. Nathaniel divided his time between guiding his company's healthcare initiatives and supporting Joe's vision, their professional collaboration enhancing rather than complicating their personal relationship. They were married the following spring, in a private ceremony in the forest garden where they had once walked during his recovery. Eleanor served as witness, and Beatrice Fleming, fully recovered and delighted by her role in their story, insisted on giving a toast. "To the ghosts who learn to be seen," she declared, raising her glass to the couple, "and to the healing that happens when we're brave enough to let others witness our broken pieces and love us anyway." As evening fell and guests departed, Joe and Nathaniel stood together on the terrace of what was now their shared home, watching the city lights flicker on below. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Joe smiled, no longer hiding in shadows, but standing confidently in the light she had once avoided. "More than, though I still prefer quiet to crowds." "Some things shouldn't change," Nathaniel agreed, kissing her temple. "They're too essential to who we are." The symphony of their unlikely love story continued to play, sometimes in crescendos of passionate purpose, sometimes in the quiet harmonies of ordinary days, but always with the profound understanding that had brought them together, that true healing comes not from avoiding pain, but from allowing ourselves to be seen in it, and that even the most broken pieces can build bridges strong enough to carry us home.